In our first video in the Evaluating Science series, we're going to define what exactly we mean by observations, testing, and how we use models in science. Everything in science begins with an observation. We're constantly observing the outside world through our senses. We see, hear, smell, feel, and sometimes taste the world around us. Whenever we write that information down or communicate it verbally, that's an observation. In science, we specifically mean observations gathered during a test or experiment. Now, if we want to get specific, there's two kinds of observations, qualitative and quantitative. Let's define each and discuss their importance. Okay, so first, quantitative or qualitative data. Okay, so qualitative data is any observation of the world that can only be expressed in words, not in numbers. These are observations that characterize the data. So if we were to take qualitative data from this picture of cats, we would say things like, there are multicolored cats. There are cats that get along with each other. The cats are calm. The cats like each other, and so forth. Now, you may have noticed that my observations are different from the ones that you might have made, and that's an important observation in and of itself. It's true that any qualitative observation I make is going to depend on the way that I personally experienced the image. My experiences, worldview, biases, and abilities are going to flavor my observations. And because of this, scientists can be critical of qualitative data because really there's more room for error. But that doesn't mean that qualitative data is useless. It's not. Qualitative data provides real and meaningful insights into the hard numbers and statistics that are also collected in experiments. Scientists that do this kind of data collection recognize the subjectivity, and so they consider themselves an instrument that filters the data. And so when they publish their findings, they make sure to thoroughly explain the choices that they make in analyzing and collecting the data. So how is this data collected, and what is it exactly? Well, a lot of time, this kind of data involves human subjects and subjective experience. So this is the focus of most social sciences. Interviews, focus group questionnaires, surveys, and data collected from historical written accounts are all kinds of qualitative research methods. In earth science, the way that humans experience and value the natural world is very important, and so this kind of data is valuable. Earth scientists also collect data from qualitative data sources while collecting the quantitative data from the test. For example, when I was out in the field in Montana collecting samples for a study, I also recorded the weather, my first impressions, and even my state of mind for each sample that I collected. Okay, so now let's get back to our cute little picture of the kitties and talk about quantitative data. Now, quantitative data is any observation that is measurable. These are things like heat, percent of bleaching in coral, the number of subjects, really anything that can be described in numbers. Our quantitative data from this image would be something like there are 12 individual cats. Only one cat is solid colored. 75% of the cats have black in their fur pattern, 50 have orange in their fur pattern, 66 have white, and 25% have gray. Can you see how this data is less subjective? In some ways, I'm still the instrument of data collection because it is what I see, but because I'm putting things into numbers and taking away any of my impressions out of it, I'm considered to be more of an impartial instrument. And because there's less human interpretation, it's thought that there's less bias and the data is harder to refute out of hand. Okay, so quantitative data is usually what we think of first when we think of science. This is where we measure physical objects, project our data into the future so that we can make predictions, and categorize our observations into types, numbers, and order. So how do we get all this data? Well, we get them from tests, which means we have to experiment. There are many ways to set up an experiment. We can either let nature do it for us, and then we need to be able to separate out all the extra information from our specific data, or we can control everything about the conditions of the test and do it in a lab space. Either way, we do try to control the experiment as much as possible. And what this means is that we want to isolate out a specific aspect of that system to manipulate while everything else in the system remains constant. This is called a controlled experiment. Sometimes it's either unethical or impossible to control for an experiment. Okay. For example, it would be completely unethical to infect a bunch of healthy test subjects with a disease just to observe the reaction to a medication. And it's impossible to control all the aspects of our climate system on Earth. It's just far too big and complex. So for these cases, we use models in our test. A scientific model is just a simplified representation of the system we're trying to test. And usually, the more detailed you make your model, the closer it resembles the system you're testing. So let's take a look at that second example of the Earth's climate. To model the behavior of the Earth's atmosphere and climate, we start looking at the system as a whole and noticing the different variables, which are things that we can measure. This is stuff like temperature, pressure, chemistry, humidity, stuff like that. Now, if we assign just one number for each of these variables, we would get an average for the whole planet. But that's not a great model if we want to see what the conditions are like in Saudi Arabia versus Antarctica. Okay, so we put all of these variables into this imaginary grid on the atmosphere, and then we make boxes in the grid as small as our computers can handle, and then assign mathematical equations for each of those variables in each of those boxes to mimic how they interact with each other on Earth. And we give the model historical data measurements for each of those variables so that they can calibrate. And now we have a complex and precise model. And this model can be used in all kinds of experiments where we can change the amount of carbon in the atmosphere and see how things change without actually putting the planet at any sort of risk. Okay, and that's it. Next in the series is our video on pseudoscience and how it contrasts with the content of this video.